Seth Emerson, theathletic.com, SEC football offseason tiers. Had the story, contacted him, asked him to join us on 365 Sports. Seth, it's amazing. It's such a deep conference, and yet, really over the years, there's always been those one or two, whether it was Alabama or Georgia, maybe one. So as deep as it is, it does appear as if Texas and Georgia are the ones at the top yet again. Does that surprise you?
Surprise? I think I'd be surprised if it still plays out that way. Like the SEC, because of the schedule and how mixed up it is now, I think teams are going to eat each other up. Texas, I think one of the reasons that they stood out last year, and they were the only ones that were like clear of everybody, if you remember that logjam at 6-2, and then 5-3, there were a bunch of teams going into the final weekend. I think one of it was Texas's schedule. And you got to remember that everybody's schedule this year is the same, except it's just flipping home and away. So it'll change a little bit. Like Georgia goes from probably having the hardest schedule in the SEC to probably middle of the way because they don't have to go to Ole Miss and to Texas and to Alabama. They get those three at home, but they still have to play those three teams. Texas still has, they still have some hard games, but they get Texas A&M in Austin. They do go to Georgia. So it's a muddle, but the ones that you feel best about are still the two that were the best last year. I think that was proven. Ole Miss, I think, was still a team that if they had been able to win one of those games that they lost, Kentucky or Florida especially, they were right there for them. I think they were a team that potentially could have done some damage in the playoff, but, Texas and Georgia were the last two standing, and they were the only two in the championship game, and I think they've done the most in the offseason to shore up their rosters.
So of the teams besides them, you mentioned Ole Miss. South Carolina got hot at the end of the year. They got Sellers, among others, back. LSU was kind of hit and miss. A&M hit and miss. Oklahoma, man, they had to struggle, although it does appear as if they've revamped their roster, but their schedule remains very difficult. Who else in the conference, in your opinion, can maybe unseat them if it's not Ole Miss this year?
Well, Alabama is still Alabama. You have the questions about quarterback, but everyone has a question about quarterback until they get their quarterback. So maybe Ty Simpson is the guy. And maybe by the end of the year, we're talking about him as one of the top 4 or 5 quarterbacks in the SEC. And if we are, then that might be good enough for Alabama, which has a lot of talent in other places. And I think a lot of Alabama people would be like, well, why are you assuming Georgia, for instance, is fine with Gunnar Stockton and not Ty Simpson? Because Gunnar Stockton has a game and a half of experience, very key games, obviously. So Alabama's the first one. South Carolina and Ole Miss obviously were the ones last year. Ole Miss has more roster turnover, but their quarterback, Austin Simmons, did look good when he came in for that one drive against Georgia. South Carolina has roster turnover on defense, a little bit on offense, but they've still got Lenore Sellers coming back. So that's the main thing with them is he's kind of the X factor there. The teams that, I grouped them not so much in tiers of who should do the best. I did Texas, then Georgia. But after that, it was the teams we just talked about, Ole Miss, Alabama, South Carolina, a little bit LSU. But then after that, there are a bunch of these blue blood programs that could rise up this year. Auburn, Florida, Oklahoma especially. And Oklahoma has done a lot in the offseason. A lot of people think John Mateer, their quarterback transfer from Washington State, could be one of the most impactful quarterback transfers in the country. And they've, look, under Brent Venables, they're going to have a good defense. They need to get the offense in gear. And if Mateer is as good as expected, if the receivers are healthy, if the O-line is even a little bit better, Oklahoma could do some damage. And Auburn and Florida are interesting too because of quarterback. Auburn got a new quarterback out of the portal, and Jackson Arnold, Oklahoma's old quarterback. Does he make a big move? Florida has, they finished better as last season went on. If DJ Lagway's shoulder is healthy, but there's just so many questions for everybody, for all of these teams. And there's ifs for Texas and Georgia as well. It's just a few less ifs. Like Texas's big if, I think, is the O-line. Georgia's is also the O-line, and whether Gunnar Stockton is, he doesn't have to be one of the best quarterbacks in the SEC, but, can he be one of the top 6 or 7? We're all assuming that Arch Manning is going to be really good for Texas. So this is what we do in the preseason. We look at who has everyone coming back and who has the least amount of flaws. And I think Texas has the least flaws. Georgia has the second amount of least flaws.
It's interesting. I mentioned all the teams, and I didn't mean to overlook Alabama, but it's like never would have done that before and shouldn't have done it this time. And then you see what Kalen DeBoer was able to keep his roster intact after mass turnover with him coming in and Saban coming out. How much has he stabilized, although wins and losses will mean everything, but how much do you think he stabilized there in Tuscaloosa after the first year?
I think he definitely has stabilized it, and it didn't really go off the tracks to begin with him. Like Caden Proctor was a great example of that. Like when he initially transferred back home to Iowa, it was like, oh, here we go. That was on top of Caleb Downs leaving, and I think it was Isaiah Bond going to Texas.
Yeah.
But then Proctor comes back. And overall, they've stabilized it. I think the two things that give you pause about Alabama, besides quarterback, is that they didn't finish well last year. They didn't leave a great impression. They had a dud of a bowl game against Michigan. And, you can say this is the same Michigan team that beat Ohio State, the eventual national champions, but it was still a 7-5 team.
Yeah.
And that was with Alabama not really having opt-outs. Like their guys played in that game. Milroe played in that game. And the other thing that gives you pause is Alabama hasn't exploded on the scene in the transfer portal. They haven't even done – Texas did some more high-profile portal stuff. Georgia did more targeted stuff where they shored up concerned spots at especially receiver, but also running back and edge rusher. Alabama didn't do too much, didn't do anything that was really eye-popping. But again, it's still Alabama. So no one would be surprised if at the end of the year they end up back in the SEC championship game.
We mentioned Oklahoma about Mateer, and of course they got Ott from California, among others. And how much do you feel like if they're not careful, no matter the schedule, strength, whatever, but if they're not careful, they go into treading water? Not that they'll be no one cares anymore, but how critical is it this year that they win a couple of games that get people's attention and also are just better?
I missed you at the start. You said Alabama?
No, Oklahoma. I'm sorry.
Oklahoma, yeah. Well, I think, it's critical for Venables to get to, I'd say, you never want to put an arbitrary number on it, but 8 or 9 wins, which it shouldn't be hard considering they're coming off of, I forget, were they 5-7 or 6-6 or, they should be able to make some improvements, but Venables also a couple years ago did win 10 games. So if he only, it's going to be more about, like you said, get a win or two that makes people believe. I don't know if that means beating Texas, but, beat Alabama again. It's going to be tough to do that in Tuscaloosa, but, get some wins like that give you some momentum and be competitive. And also show that the offense is going in the right direction, because there does come a point with this kind of thing. I think you saw it with Muschamp at Florida when they could never get the offense right. And ultimately with Muschamp, it was overall wins and losses, but so much of the frustration was that he couldn't get the offense right. And there just became a conclusion that he just doesn't know how to fix it. And with Venables, he's got to make sure he doesn't become pigeonholed as the defensive guy who just can't, as a head coach, he doesn't know how to produce a good offense.
Seth, Tennessee had the drama with Nico Iamaleava, and they basically flipped quarterbacks with UCLA. Heupel and Tennessee, they're a part of the conversation. But how much of the season is on Heupel even though at the beginning everyone was frustrated with Nico, his father, whatever, his handlers, how much does he have to like, hey, we're fine no matter who's our quarterback?
Yeah, when all that happened, there was this big rally effect around Heupel, and a lot of people saying that Heupel kind of has a mulligan this year. Like everyone kind of understands that this happened, but that'll go away, and it might already be going away the closer you get to the season. And the first time you lose some games, you shouldn't lose, or lose in a way that is worse. Like Georgia comes in there in September. What if Georgia comes in there and blows them out? Now, Heupel's not in any job danger or whatever. He's done great. He's gotten Tennessee out of the wilderness. He's gotten Tennessee to relevancy. But the question with Heupel going forward is going to be, does he have a ceiling? Can he burst through that ceiling? Can he get this program to the semifinals? Can he win an SEC championship? He hasn't even been in an SEC championship game yet. So that's going to be the question. And I don't think anyone's expecting that this year because of what happened with Nico, but also, they lost some pieces elsewhere, including like James Pierce. But you don't want to go too much backwards. You don't want to go to 6-6. You don't want to even go to 7-5. So, but I think if it's 8-4 with a competitive, the being reasonably competitive in those 4 games and maybe win a game that really rallies people like Georgia or Alabama, then people will feel okay.
Who is more of a wild card? And you alluded to them, Seth Emerson, The Athletic.com, and the SEC. Who is more of a wild card at quarterback on how well they perform, with both expected to be good? You mentioned Lagway, Florida, and then obviously Mateer at Oklahoma. How are those two that could like not flip the script in the conference, but really like they're both look to be dynamic?
Yeah, and they both could be. You could have something special there with Lagway if he's healthy and if he can put it all together. And Mateer, that one could be one because he was at Washington State. It could go a couple ways. Did he not get enough attention because he was at Washington State and the Pac-12, really the Pac-2, and that just becomes a great move by Oklahoma, a great steal, and there aren't more programs kind of kicking themselves for we should have hopped on that earlier? Or does that become a little bit of an overhyped kind of thing? Mm-hmm. I don't know. I think with Lagway, it's probably just a matter of, does he stay healthy? And does Florida have enough weapons around him? I think he can be something special. There's a lot of like wild card quarterbacks around the SEC. Gunnar Stockton, we don't know if he's going to, if you take the way he ran the ball against Texas and the way he threw the ball against Notre Dame, you've got a good quarterback, but does he put that together in every game or is he really inconsistent and Georgia sinks down? Alabama, Ty Simpson or whoever ends up quarterback is potentially the most important quarterback in the SEC because quarterback play there could decide how good they are. Jackson Arnold, was he just in a bad situation at Oklahoma because of their O-line and their receiver injuries, or is he just not the 5-star that he was rated to be coming out? And you've got your Diego Pavia, obviously. Like, how much can he lift Vanderbilt? Can they steal some more games this year? And on down the list, guys we don't talk about, like Taylon Green at Arkansas. This year is going to be, I think, really interesting at quarterback in the SEC, and that's even well beyond just Arch Manning, the one that most people are talking about.
Well, and speaking of which, he's the chosen one, and listen, he's handled all this very well, been patient. Ewers was really good, took him to consecutive semifinals, but a lot of times it's who's the backup quarterback. And then in the case of Arch, because of the history, the family, whatever, and I think he can handle anything because of how he's been around, how the family has been. But is there almost too much on his shoulders, or do you feel like it doesn't matter?
I don't think it matters with him. He's been everything we've known about him is that he can handle this stuff. And the fact that he sat for 2 years and he came to Texas knowing he was going to sit a couple years. His finalist when it wasn't Texas was Georgia, and he knew he would probably sit behind Carson Beck for a couple years. He's just got that maturity that, comes obviously from his family lineage. And that would be a huge surprise if he doesn't do well at Texas this year. I'm not saying that, it's Heisman or bust, but you just expect him to have a very good year, a solid year at a minimum, and a great year as a ceiling.
Last question. The SEC, we know, I mean, they're not afraid to tell you how good they are, but the Big Ten has won their last 2 national titles with Michigan and Ohio State. And then we know the ACC and the Big 12 are kind of clinging on. They're hoping to have success. They're not going to get as many teams in the tournament, or I guess you could say the playoff. There's a lot of that going on. Are they as good as Sankey says they are, to a point where there's almost an arrogance there, in your opinion? They earned all these national titles where nobody else has anything close. But what do you think overall about the SEC as they enter 2025?
Well, I think there's something to prove for the league after the last couple of years not being in the national championship game. And last year, the only team they had, only getting 3 teams in the playoff, and Tennessee going 1 and out, Georgia going 1 and out in 2 games that weren't that close, and Texas barely beating Arizona State and then losing to Ohio State. So there's been a lot of shots taken at the SEC, and it was a long time coming. A lot of people were looking forward to an opportunity to take those shots, and I think that one of the overplayed things, that this is what you hear from especially Big Ten area people, but other people, is that, with NIL in the portal, when everybody can pay players, the SEC doesn't have an advantage anymore because they over the years, they cheated to get those players, blah, blah, blah. And I'm not saying they didn't, but if you look at the NFL draft this past year, the SEC still had easily the most players drafted. If you look at the recruiting rankings, the SEC still has the preponderance of 5 stars and 4 stars. It's that the talent is more spread around. It's that the Alabamas and the Georgias and the Texases don't have the ability to stack depth anymore, because players can go in the portal if they can see after a year or 2 that they're not going to be starters. And so the question, this year and beyond is, does the SEC continue to kind of eat each other up? Mm-hmm. Or do you have some of these teams emerge, and do you get back to having SEC dominance of the playoff? And I don't know. I don't think there'll be dominance the way there were in the old days, just because of the way the whole system is set up. It might be kind of the SEC and the Big Ten trading off national champions and finalists with your Notre Dames and an occasional ACC and Big 12 team kind of sneaking in there. But I don't know whether, is Texas going to be is it going to be their year? Maybe. But I think that the SEC is fine. They're not going anywhere. But it'll be interesting to see if people can be able to continue taking shots at them based on playoff performance this year.
Yeah, well, because we cover we cover everybody. That's why we have you on, and we've had you on before. But the Big 12 doesn't have what you consider an alpha dog or logo, because of with Texas and OU leaving, and OU dominated the conference for a long time. But you'd see someone like K-State or Oklahoma State or TCU or Baylor rise up, and win the conference, if not once but twice. But yet the SEC doesn't see that often, right? They're deep as they could possibly be, but boy, wouldn't it be interesting if someone like LSU's been there, but just somebody else get up there rather than it's Texas or Georgia or Alabama. And yet it's a battering ram, and it's hard to do that. You got to be good, not just one game like Vanderbilt for a game or 2, but everybody, every weekend and week out. Seth, thank you very much, buddy. Appreciate your time as always. We have so many writers on disaappointing.com on 365 Sports.